In Search of the Source, Chapter 9, Bad Raps in Egypt. Joseph was a dreamer. He started dreaming in Genesis 37 and then lived those dreams out for the next dozen chapters. The Philoppa loved the story of Joseph. In the days when we were translating it, there was lots of talk about Joseph in church and around the village. They strongly identified with him, favored by his father, yet put down by his brothers, given dreams of future glory, but shunned and falsely accused in the meantime. Yet through it all, his character was faultless, and his trust was in God. Hapele, Isa, and I had been to the translation workshop, and when we returned, we threw out the whole first draft and worked it over again. 10 more men had joined in the process, with others coming from time to time. Our pace of working often stopped to analyze words, explain culture, both Philoppa and biblical, and continually working out grammar. It wasn't exactly a thrill a minute. But the slowness and the continual discussion enabled all of us to stand in awe of the content and deep meaning of every passage. Joseph had hit the pits. His brothers had thrown him in, and there he might have stayed until his bones bleached. But for one brother's better idea, they sell him into slavery. 20 pieces of silver wouldn't go far among 10 brothers, but it would get him off their hands and would free their conscience of murder. Joseph was alone in Egypt, but God was with him. That was apparent in everything he did. Though he'd been humbled from his former position of favored son, he was faithful in what was put before him. He made an excellent slave. He was sharp, organized, and natural leader. He picked up the new language, handled mathematics, finances, and people. Besides that, he was young, good-looking, and well-built. He had bete. Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard, bought him in the slave market and put him to work. In time, Joseph was in charge of the whole place: house, fields, slaves, finances, everything except the food Potiphar ate and his wife. The only problem was the wife. With her husband often gone and no housework to do, she had time on her hands. What was there to do but lounge around the house all day in her Nefertiti frocks? And that hunk of Hebrew slave looked better to her every day. The story got more interesting every day. For the Philoppa, ratings for this soap opera could top any of the charts. We translated. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." "How's that?" the men interrupted. She said, "Come to bed with me. You know?" They looked confused. In my plainest Philoppa, I reworded it. She wanted him to act as though he were her husband. "Oh," they said. "But we don't say it that way." "How do you say it?" "We say, Isaasepe. That translates, get me." Fair enough. I wrote it down that way and we moved on. "Get me," she said. And though she spoke to him day after day, he refused to get her or even to be with her. Next verse. One day he went into the house to attend his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Get me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Everybody at the table was struck by the moral strength of Joseph. Certainly he had passions like everybody else. He was young and alone and had suffered much. Here was his opportunity for pleasure, and with the privacy, who would know anything? Ironically, in our discussions, we hung we got hung up for a moment about the place of privacy. In Papua New Guinea, cultures where houses are small and families are large, relationships between husbands and wives are relegated to the garden. The cover of the bush is the only place that is private. When Potiphar's wife tried to get Joseph inside the house, he ran out to the garden to get away. It all seemed reversed. So they would go out into the garden, out into the jungle to get privacy, and that's where Joseph ran to get away from Potiphar's wife. But that's the way it was there. Some places are just different. We translated the next section. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, he called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came here to get me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak and ran out of the house." We got to that last part. When we got to that last part, all the men in the Bible house, already on the edge of their seats, leaned forward in one voice and yelled, "That's a lie!" Fists clenched, jaws tightened, veins bulged on necks. It was a scandal. How could such a man, so upright, so guileless, be treated this way by a no-good woman? Then it got worse. In the next paragraph, when Potiphar came home, he believed her. Potiphar burned with anger at Joseph, and the Philoppa burned with anger at his wife and the injustice of it all. But no words are recorded of any defense from Joseph as he was hauled away to prison. Day after day the men came, watching to see how Joseph would get out of prison and become second in command in all Egypt. In spite of what was on the surface, the man really did have bete. God had let things seem to fall apart, but in the end, he showed that he'd had control all along. After we finished Genesis in first draft, we got a new group of men together for a checking session. We were going through it all again with people who had no previous exposure to the translation to make sure it was communicating clearly. We read it aloud. Carol was there in the Bible house too, typing revised manuscripts, just managing to stay ahead of us as we read along. Joseph made a real impact on this group, just like with those who worked on the first draft. There he was, falsely accused, imprisoned, but always rising to the top in spite of bad situations. He was a dreamer, and dreams are significant in Philoppa culture. He had been wronged by his brothers. Relationships between brothers figure very prominently in Philoppa legends. The apparent intrigue and deception between them after Joseph got out of prison and became leader of Egypt was just their kind of meat. Joseph wasn't telling them who he was. He demanded that they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, if they were to ever see his face and get food again. Then when they did, he tricked them into a false accusation of stealing, where Benjamin was implicated and heading for jail. The brothers knew they had hit bottom at that point, and the Philoppa very much identified. The brothers knew that they had finally met with justice for the sin committed against their brother so long ago. They still did not know that very brother was standing before them. The Philoppa feel this same heaviness that the brothers felt. Among them, the knowledge that they stand in position of continually deserving punishment is a common theme. The brothers were guilty of spilling innocent blood, and now it was coming back to haunt them. The Philoppa feel that all the time. Philoppa culture corresponds with Old Testament culture in many ways, and this is one of them. There is a very strong bond between father and son, and a particularly unique one with the youngest son. The Philoppa call him the milk stops baby, and they could identify with Jacob's great reticence to give Benjamin up. The news of Benjamin's imprisonment, once it reached the father, would bring down his life in bitterness and sorrow. Finally, Judah, who had promised his father he'd guard Benjamin with his life, begged Joseph to let him take Benjamin's place. Still checking for clarity of translation, we read, "So now, if the boy is not with us when we go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow." Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, "If I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come upon my father." I looked up to see if the text was communicating. The men were silent, sitting cross-legged on the floor in their ruggedness, some shirtless, expressions dark, chests heaving. I saw one brush a tear from his eye. I read on. After that, Joseph could no longer control himself either. He, too, knew of the special bond between father and youngest son. He, too, knew that if the brothers returned to the father without the youngest son, the father really would die. But he saw the loyalty and love that the older brother was willing to take the sentence of the younger brother, and was pleading to do it. Joseph broke down, went to the other room, and wept aloud. When he returned, he confessed who he really was, their own brother. At that point, we had reached the end of the page. Carol was still typing the latest draft, and we had caught up to her. For the moment, there was no more to read, and as it was time for a break anyway, I went and busied myself with tea and bread for everybody. But behind me, all remained quiet, all but the typewriter. I looked back. There were men gathered all around Carol, reading the words one at a time, as they came onto the page from the typewriter. The tea and bread could wait. They apparently had food I knew not of. By the time the page was finished, Joseph had told how he had known his brothers all along, that he remembered their sin against him, but that he was not going to work payback on it. But rather, he had seen how God was using him to help when they needed it most. At this point, one of the older men looked up at me. Putting his hand to his throat in serious Philoppa gesture, he said, "We are dying of the deliciousness of these words." He picked up the paper Carol had just finished and read a verse. "And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." He looked around at the others, and then out the window. He spoke slowly. The brother whom they had most greatly offended, he said, was in the end the one who had the most power to destroy them. Yet he passed it over. Instead, he became the one who rescued them. He sighed and said, "That's a great bete here."